well. So
okay, so I think we should start this time. So good morning or good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to chair this session on narratives. We have Harro Maas as the first presenter. So Harro, please. Do you have slides to share? Or?
I have slides to share, and I'm going to share them now, if all goes well. That's this one. And so do you all see one screen? Just one screen, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so I'm going to talk about Marshall's narrative, a composite portrait. And part of my interest, it comes from two things. One is a conference that I attended that was organized by Mary and by Tom Stapleford on narratives, but the other has reasons for my own preoccupation with Marshall over the past years. I've been writing a couple of papers on Marshall now, and for this paper, I think it is best to take the book of John Sutton that I also use in this paper as a sort of strawman, to take that as a point of departure. And people may know this, a really wonderful book of John Sutton, Marshall's Tendencies, What Can Economists Know? And if I summarize that book in a sort of strawman version, then I read many of the chapters in that book as a sort of a triad of personal experiences, for example, at airports, that were told as narratives. Hey, there is something that's striking me. And then Sutton is modeling this personal experience as many economists make models, but he is sort of emphasizing you can do that sort of small-scale modeling. And then he's testing that model and then getting back to these personal experiences. And he talks about that way of proceeding as Marshall's tendency. So tendencies, of course, is not a new word or term in history and methodology of economics. It's something that has been addressed in many books on the history and methodology of economics. And mostly it's not associated with Marshall, but with Mill. What can economists know? The world is very complex and we can only get at the tendencies. And Sutton is sort of playing with this as well. And if I think about tendencies,
Harro, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think the screen is frozen in the first slide. So try to stop sharing and share it again, because the slides are not moving for us here.
The slides are not moving. That's what I was a bit afraid of.
Sorry.
So, no, of course. So I have to find another screen to share. It's always the same thing. Are you seeing a screen now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And are you seeing a next screen?
Yes.
John Sutton?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the book?
Yes.
Okay, good. So if you think about tendencies, then I think mostly about Mill and this distinction between contributing causes and disturbing causes, and then Mill as making this this move in which he is concentrating on only a couple of causes leaving out others and saying this is what an economist can do. This is the way that economics can proceed as a science. And as I said, Sutton is, I think, capitalizing on that way of looking at tendencies, but I think in an interesting way, because the way that he's using these personal experiences, I think adds very much a different flavor to the way Mill is thinking about these tendencies. But then it's Marshall's tendencies. And as I have been doing some work on Marshall's tendencies, I was not quite convinced that Marshall was, say, the poster boy to talk about tendencies in the way that Sutton was doing. And this is not a paper that is trying to correct Sutton on how to really read Marshall, because I think that's perhaps not so interesting. But I hope to be able to show something different in Marshall's way of using these kinds of narratives that Sutton is talking about, but then different kinds of narratives. So I try to show in my paper that Marshall is absolutely using narratives. I think there's no one who will dispute Marshall's use of narratives either. And then I try to show there are different narratives, and Marshall is sort of puzzling, sorting out how he can combine these different kinds of narratives in one kind of narrative. And I think that is very close to economic history. And of course, that is something that Marshall is not doing at once, but it is something that is evolving over time. So he starts with his geometric narratives, I call that, what most people think of diagrammatic reasoning. And then I move to a second one, his use of diagrams and tables to tell a stylized causal story or a stylized causal sequence. And then I turn to script. So I want to talk about these different types of narratives in Marshall's work, what they do, and why he was not pleased or content just with his geometric narratives. I don't think the notion geometric narratives is used, but I have a specific reason to prefer geometric narratives over diagrammatic reasoning. And I will give an example in a minute. So to give a sort of, what do they do? These different kinds of narratives, geometric narratives, they help Marshall to criticize theories of other political economists, but Marshall is sort of aware, or he thinks at least, that these geometric narratives, they lack what he calls realness. He then also uses these diagrams and tables to tell a stylized causal sequence. That's the second that I talk about. And then the script that needs more development to tell you what exactly that is. So I start with these geometric narratives. And this is an image that many of you will know if you have read John Groenewegen's a wonderful biography of Marshall. And Groenewegen is reproducing this image, which is on the left-hand side. It's John Stuart Mill principles. It's John Stuart Mill's discussion of Ricardo's theory of rent. John Stuart Mill is making the same kind of experiments, mental experiments or paper experiments or verbal experiments, if you like, as Ricardo is making. And Marshall is translating these experiments in diagrams, and mostly the emphasis is on the diagrams that Marshall is developing. And then you have this famous expression that Marshall is developing this engine of discovery, of engine of inquiry. I never know how to pronounce that word. which is about diagrams. But I think if you look at the right-hand side, you see that there is a lot of writing. And so it's not just a diagram that Marshall is making, but Marshall is explaining for himself what is happening in the diagram. And he is doing that in the properties of the diagram, and that diagram is geometric. So he will talk about geometric properties of the diagram, and he will infer conclusions about that. So here, I don't know if you can read that, but that's perhaps not the most important thing to read that. John Stuart Mill is talking about improvements of the land, that Ricardo is talking about a different kind of improvement. And then what you see, this shift from D to D prime, is one of those improvements of the land that Marshall is trying to picture in this diagram. And then he starts reasoning upon this diagram. So without going into much detail, because I don't have the time, of course, to do so, how that exactly works, Marshall is developing, he's seeing I can do quite some new things with this diagrammatic method, but the reasoning upon it is very important. And that's the middle diagram that I show, that I took from, now I forgot his name, John Whittaker, wonderful edition of Marshall's mathematical notebooks. What you see is yet another diagram in which Marshall is reasoning upon the theories of rent developed by Mill, Ricardo, and others. And then he is starting to criticize on the basis of the form of the curves and on the areas that are described by these curves. He is criticizing his predecessors. And I just give a quote. I hope you can read some of the quotes. I'm not going to read all of the quotes, but to emphasize that Marshall is sort of hesitant about the realness, as I said, the way that he calls it, the realness of these diagrams. And there are probably many such. That's a reference to properties of the land that Marshall takes as an empirical fact or an empirical finding, but he does not give any evidence for it. And he is clearly worried about where does the evidence come from. So he is able to develop criticism of his of fellow economists and his predecessors on the basis of this engine of inquiry, but he is not able to bridge to form a bridge from these diagrams to the empirical reality, if you like. Now, he's better able to do so with this second type of diagrams, that tables and diagrams that I talked about, in which he's doing, I think, something different. So what I show here is Marshall talking about the business cycle, cyclical movements in, I just call it the business cycle. And he's, on the left-hand side, he's tabling different phases of the business cycle that you see on the right-hand side in that diagram. So you have all these letters, and then he is on the left-hand side giving some properties of that specific phase, and then trying to get at causal connections between these different phases. And I also here I give a quote from his notebook in which you see that there is reasoning about the relation between these different phases that is constructing a narrative on how a business cycle is evolving through time, with the help of this table and this diagram. So I would call that stylized fact reasoning that he is using here. And for those who have difficulties in reading on the left-hand side, I just give very briefly a transcription of what he is saying there. So, for example, if you look at E, credit restricted, no one very willing to lend, and then what is happening with the interest that is rising to panic levels, and what's happening with prices. All prices are falling, if I see that correctly as fast as I can see that now. So those are different kinds of narratives that he's developing. The first, understanding and criticizing fellow economists. The second, constructing causal narratives. And Marshall was still sort of concerned with how do these stories that I tell, how do they relate to the land of dry facts, as he called it, so to empirical reality, if I can call it that way. At the end of the 1860s, he started to collect all sorts of data. I can't go into details here because that's really a long story. But he starts to collect all sorts of data, and he starts experimenting on how can I reshuffle these data to get some sort of grip on a presentation of these data. And it's a really a big book. It's a folio, a volume. You see it on the right-hand side here. I have a ruler against it to give some sort of impression of how big it is. I just give you a couple of impressions of its content. On the horizontally, vertically, you see the time X, and then you see that he is pasting materials from others, from Jevons, for example, but he's also drawing graphs himself, and he's combining that with specific events. I'm not going to explain what you see here, but it's just to give a kind of impression of what you can find in that book. And then he is experimenting with different ways of presenting this variety of materials as well. And I think it is important to keep in mind that, of course, people talk a lot about Marshall's principles. But Marshall published other books as well, and Marshall had very great difficulty in finding a sort of shape for these later books, Industry and Trade, and then Money, Credit, and Commerce, if I have the title of that last volume right. Don't keep me to it, but Industry and Trade for sure. And though you might say he was not quite certain how to do that. This search for a way of presenting a manifold of effects is an important step in writing at least Industry and Trade. That's what I will try to show here, and then I will finish. So what you see here is a plate of some 2 meters in length. And then, so you have some sort of impression, this is really a big thing. And of course, you cannot read this, but I would like to draw your attention to the left-hand side here, enlarge that a bit. And then you can perhaps read, but perhaps not, but I will read you a couple. He is talking about credit, about money, about public borrowing. He is talking, so those are the red labels. He's talking about labor legislation, Factory Act. He's talking about wars. He's talking about political events. And I think very interesting, you see, you might say statistical figures, prices and quantities on agricultural, so agricultural data. You don't see them graphed anymore, but you see them as numbers. And I think this is an important step for Marshall, because he's sort of shifting from representing quantified data in a way that fits better with other kinds of data, non-numerical data, like who was the prime minister, Peel or someone else. And so he's trying to get these different kinds of information on one side, in one kind of space, a space in which he can line out what is happening first, what's going second, and so forth, and then trying to combine these different elements in a narrative. And so that's what and that's where I finish on. I hope I'm still within. I'm almost done. Okay. So what you see here is another element of this large graph. And very quickly, here you see a repeal of the corn laws. Here you see some of these data. I think these are the prices. It can be the quantities of agriculture. Here, gold discoveries. Here you see wars. Here, the annexation of Punjab. And then he is summarizing these data on agriculture in terms of large bad harvests. So it's not so much these data themselves that are important, but he tries to think about them as events in terms of something that he can compare with gold discoveries, or as you see here, the last one, potato disease. And then appeal is important for the repeal of the corn laws, of course. So this is just one extract of industry and trade, in which I put in red some of the elements that you can see in that script, because I refer to that as a script. This large table is a script from which he, Marshall, which he used to compose the text of industry and trade. But if you read this, even this small fragment, then it is not just the elements on this script, but there are also these principles that he talked about in his much earlier work, these geometric narratives, supply and demand, that comes in here as well. So it's not that he's sort of abandoning his earlier thinking and reasoning about economics, but he's trying to combine them, and that's why I call it a composite portrait in one way. He's telling that that is the way that you should do economics. He's telling that to Bowley. Since it never happens that all facts can be expressed in numbers, the application of exact mathematical methods is nearly always a waste of time. And I don't have the time to do so. I don't do in the paper either, but I think it is very interesting to compare this way of working with Keynes' criticism of Tinbergen. But that's a sort of teaser for the end. So I leave it there.
Thank you very much, Harro. So we have some time for questions and comments. So if you want to raise your hand, and then I can open the mic. Marcel, please.
Yes, thank you, Harro, for your interesting and always inspiring talk. I just some questions about the approach. You call it narratives, so that is yes. It's in the title. You didn't relate that in your talk, and well, I'm thinking when you talk about narratives, I must think about Mary's work on narratives, in which the idea of collocation is quite central to it. And I'm just wondering whether that your approach is some kind of a response to that, so that you come up with a script is perhaps something, or perhaps I should ask a question, what would be the relationship between the collocation and a script? And yeah, that is the question.
Yeah, I think that, so initially I thought that I could use that notion of colligation, but I'm not quite sure I can use it. And the reason is that as I understand colligation, and that may be not the right way to understand it, so Mary can correct me, but that is combining different elements to get at a more general notion. At least that is how I understand Ewell's use of it. So you get from specifics to something more general. That's not what is happening here. And I think that is that. So certainly for the last script, which I myself think is very important for Marshall, and one of the reasons that he was searching for different ways of representing the economy, not in terms of this stylized diagram, not in terms of an analytical or geometric, as I still prefer for Marshall, diagram. He is searching for an explanation of history in terms of principles, but it is not that he's trying to bring specific events in historical time under the umbrella of a general principle. That's not what he is doing. And so colligation, in a sense, is not what is happening, at least not in industry and trade, and not in that script. But it is a way of combining different elements, of course. So if it is anything, then it is rather this perhaps loose notion of synthesis, where synthesis also has this notion of colligation. Not incidentally, Ewell is using his reading of Kant to get to this notion of colligation. So that's a difficult notion as well. So it's bringing coherence in different elements. I think that is why I steer away from. Yeah, is that an answer? It's an answer.
Thank you, Harro. We have one more question from Alexandra.
Yes, thank you. I have two quick questions. One is, I might have missed it, but you teasered in the beginning that you would explain why you prefer to use geometric narratives rather than diagrammatical reasoning. And I would be very curious to hear what you think about that, because in my experience, often then you get the reply, but it's just this other thing, this narrative. So I would be curious to see why you insist on using narratives. And the other quick question is, I have no idea, is it this this data book you presented by Marshall, is it a very common way of working at the time, or was it a specialty by Marshall to come up with this kind of database or something?
Yes, it's a sort of database. I must confess, I don't know. So to start with the last, I don't know if this is something that is common among economists at the time. Of course, I do know that another economist that I did write a lot about was collecting a lot of materials as well, Stanley Jevons, but not in this kind of book form. And I think the book form is sort of special for Marshall. But that's something that I think, but I don't know. The other on diagrammatic reasoning. I think what the geometric is perhaps more important here than reasoning or narrative, because why geometric? Because Marshall is reasoning or telling a story about geometrical properties of the curves that he is drawing in that diagram. And that is important, and I can show that in detail that is important. It's not as you might have in suppose we introduce a text and then the supply curve is moving up or something, and then without talking about the specific way in which it is moving up and what that means for the distance between the one and the other. And so the specifics of the areas that change and the specific of the distances between the lines, that's something that Marshall pays much attention to. And that's why I think it is geometric, because that's more specific than diagrammatic, in which I can use graphs to talk in a loose way without paying much attention to the specifics of, and it may have evolved, it did evolve, of course, in that direction, but for Marshall, it started out more specific. That's what I would like to emphasize.
Okay, Harro, thank you so much. I'm sorry I have to cut the
Sure.
discussion and move to the next paper. So we now have Guilhem Lecouteux. I'm sure that I mispronounced your name, so sorry for that.
It's almost that. It's
okay.
Yeah.
So the Homer Economicus narrative on a psychologically flawed justification of epistocracy from human relations school to nudging policies. So Guilhem, please.
Normally you should see my screen now.
Yes.
So just first, actually, just as a forward, I would like to apologize because I missed all yesterday's session. Because right now I'm in Pristina in Kosovo, and we had a massive power outage yesterday for 8 hours. So now it seems to work well, but if ever I disappeared at some point, maybe it does again. So don't worry, it's still electricity. For now it works. So let's hope I will be able to finish that. So in this paper, the title is a bit long. So I want to focus on what I call the Homer Economicus narrative, and actually to draw a parallel between something which is happening right now with behavioral policies on the development of nudging policies, and what happened in the 2030s with the human relations school. So a common narrative we have today in behavioral economics, so if you're not familiar, so we have this idea, so that's what we can teach, for instance, in business school seminars or in quick introduction, or if you have an interview of a famous behavioral economics in the New York Times, that's the stories I will tell, that before economists studied extremely rational persons like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, or people who are extremely rational, didn't make any mistake without emotions, while in real life, people are more like Homer Simpson. We have lots of emotion, we do mistake, we are very bad at planning events, etc. And since we are very different from what we look in theory, we should investigate more how we behave in real life, and maybe we should also adjust public policies in this light. And in this paper, what I would like to suggest that this type of discourse we have today was a bit similar, was something similar in the 20s. So here, this, so a bit from Kassenstein in 2015. So part of this, of the Homer economics narrative, is to use this, the idea of that people have two cognitive systems. So today we call that system one, which is the automatic system, like all the habits we have, all our small heuristics. While on the other hand, we have a system two, which is deliberative, which is reflective. And what Sustin is saying, that even though system one runs the show in most of our life, we focus on short term, we suffer from inertia, we fail to plan, etc., etc. So very often, actually, we try to delegate our decision. We make decision about decision, and we're choosing not to choose an important one of them. On the other hand, human beings want to strengthen the hand of system two. So we would like to be more rational than when we actually are. And now I'll just show you a quote from Elton Mayo, actually, in the 1923. So what he's saying here is that the civilized mentality doesn't differ by much from that of the savage. In both, we find the total situation is dominated by a marked dissociation. On here, you find again set of system one, system two, say. So certain thoughts and activities are controlled by the day mind. So that was system two in the previous quotes. So product of concentrating thinking on disciplined reverie. And certain other idea and action are controlled by the night mind, the product of unacknowledged reveries on the minimum of concentration. And the conclusion is the same, that the problem of civilization is to extend the area of understanding and to diminish the area of mind control. So give more power to the day mind, or system two in Sunstein, and less to the night mind. So it's based on actually, so I found this actually completely a bit randomly. I was preparing a course on the theory of the firm, and I looked at some of Mayo's writing, and I found that, and I said, maybe actually I can make a connection between what I'm working on behavioral economics, on what Elton Mayo was saying at the time. So in this presentation, I will start by presenting the whole Homer economics narrative on where this paper fits in this in my project on this topic. Then say a few things to draw this parallel between the two literature, which is the idea that what is not rational is pathological, and therefore we should correct that. Public policies should correct that. And in the end, how this leads to new type of policy which give power to experts, and in which we deny basically citizens the right to choose how to live, fundamentally. The idea of the Homer Economicus narrative, so I'll go a bit quickly on that because that's not the main historical point of the paper, but just to give you an idea of the project I'm working on right now. So this is one of the opening citation of Nudge of 2017. So they explicitly talk about Homer Simpson, and they want to see how we can make the world easier or safer for the Homers among us. And my idea is actually, what if we take Homer Simpson seriously? Actually, is it such a bad thing to be Homer Simpson? Maybe actually we can have a good life. If you look at the show, actually it's quite happy in the end. So is it so terrible? Or maybe actually do we have maybe good reason to be more like Homer than Mr. Spock? That's my starting point. And in this Homer Economics narrative, you have those three main claims. At first, the idea that neoclassical economists are committed to an implausible model of the economic agents, we call econs, that suppose that we choose and reason unfailingly well. The second step is to say that actually we had lots of experiments in cognitive psychology, in economics, showing that we are affected by many biases. We often err, and in the end we are humans. So I put quotes here because humans are not exactly like normal human beings, are more like faulty econs than humans. And we document many experimental findings on what we call also behavioral insight. And the conclusion of that is that if we better understand individual cognition, so what happens at the human stage, it will allow us to design better policies on which are typically nudges. So in this narrative, you have three claims about what is an econ, what is a human, and which policies we should have. So in other papers, so I discuss actually what's like to be an econ, and it's not, in my opinion, to be like Mr. Spock. We could have a different idea. What is a human? And it's not the human described here. It's not the natural, the normal, let's say, like us, a human here in this webinar. In this paper, I'm more discussing about the policy size. And the idea we have with this narrative is that we consider that individuals are malfunctional. There are lots of biases, they don't choose well, and we want to fix them to the environment. And we never discuss whether maybe it's the environment which is not good. Maybe if Homer Simpson makes a lot of mistakes, it's not because there is some marketing campaigns triggering him to buy more alcohol or sugar, etc. It's just because you have some individual biases. So it's a very specific way to present the problem. That's the fault of the individuals and not of the environment. So the idea of this paper is really to investigate the historical roots of the narrative and to draw this parallel between what was said in the human relations schools and what is said in behavioral economics. So for now, actually, it's mostly a parallel. I have an idea of how to my idea, but it's not documented well enough, so I won't. So we can discuss that in the discussion after, but I will not present that. That there's a common influence by Pareto, and we find common influence of Pareto both in behavioral welfare economics and in the human relations school, but that's more, I'll say tentative. So I'm not sure of that, so we can discuss that if you're interested. So the main claim we have in both approaches is to say that what is not rational is pathological. So in behavioral paternalism for the nudging policies, so the way we can characterize that is to say that the individual it's like an inner rational agent trapped in an outer psychological shell. So deep inside, we would love to be rational. We would love to be like Mr. Spock. But the problem is that since we have all those psychological biases, we have a present bias, maybe we have inertia bias, maybe we have lots of tons of others, we are not able to fulfill our true preferences. We make mistakes, and in the end, we are very happy that there are all those benevolent social planners or choice architects who are willing to help us to achieve our own goals. So for instance, we all want to save more for our retirements, but since we are lazy, since we have a present bias, we don't do it, we postpone our decisions. So we are very happy that we have some choice architect that put the right default option so that we don't have to think about the problem and actually we automatically save more for our retirement. The problem with this kind of model is that this idea that we have deep inside the true preferences, which are actually the standard Homo Economicus, which we had in neoclassical economics, there is no good psychology theory to explain why it would be the case. In behavioral economics, we have lots of theory to explain how we deviate from the norm, why we have lots of biases, but we don't explain why by default, without biases, we would be rational. And that's clearly missing. We just explain deviations from the norm, but never the norm in itself. And the conclusion of this part of the project, actually, this model of the inner rational agent is a great analytic model. It's a great way to model how people behave. So we say that we maximize a function with a bias, and we tell the story of sexual biases, but it's not descriptive. It doesn't say how people actually choose or they actually think, and it's not normative either. It doesn't say that people should behave as, so the good way to behave is choosing without biases, with this underlying norm. But since the discourse is very convenient, because in the end what it says is that economists have predicted for a long time that people should be rational. In the lab, they are not. So it's not the theory which is wrong, it's people. People make mistakes. And economists were right all along. So maybe it's a bit comforting to think like that. So if now we come back to the human relations, what is the type of discussion we have at the time? So I won't enter into the detail, but in the folk history of organization theory, the way we teach that usually to undergrad students, that you have first Taylor in the early 20th century, then Mayo arrived in the 20s. He ran the experiment at Hawthorne, and he discovered, a bit magically, the idea of the social person. He said we should care more about individuals and be less productivist than Taylor. So now if we look more carefully about how Mayo actually gets involved in the experiment, so how he moved from Australia to the US, etc. So it appeared that there was a crucial role of the Harvard Business School, even in the funding of this research. And actually, Mayo gets lots of support among major CEOs, in particular Rockefeller. And they looked actually from what Mayo wrote before moving to the US. It was a good idea actually it was a way to resolve industrial conflict, but without jeopardizing the status on authority. So the idea that rather than saying that we should discuss with labor unions, the idea of Mayo in the end was to say that we should internalize all this discussion with workers in human resources management departments. So within the firm and not as a social conflict. And in Mayo's idea, you have this specific political project, but based on what he called psychological research. And in particular, so he wrote a series of papers which was about industrial peace and psychological research. That's something he wrote in the 20s. One of the quotes in the introduction was from this series of paper. So in a nutshell, Mayo's idea was something like that. Let's say that first, workers, they are maladjusted to the workplace and more globally to capitalism. So his intuition at the time, and which was something common at the time, that industrial civilization destroyed previously tight social bonds, and they alienated individuals from the social world. Given that, so they arrive in the firm, they're in the industrial world, they have a defective psychology that makes them prone to the socialist reverie, and this poses a threat to industrial peace and social stability. So given this new social organization, we should find a way actually to correct, to remove this risk and to prevent the open conflict between those workers prone to the socialist reverie and the social order of the industrial civilization. On this conclusion that to do this job, we need an educated elite to organize a workplace, which are fundamentally skilled businessmen who should learn how to properly run the industry so that we avoid this type of conflicts. And that was the explicit goal of this series of papers, I told you, industrial peace and psychological research. So here I just give you one quote of this article. So I have a few other at the end, so we have time, I can show you that. That's the typical type of ideas we have in Mayo. So this process from its place in the social will and structure to the unaware of the real social and psychological cause of dissatisfaction. So workers are just touched with reality. So like the neurotic individual, so we have the pathological thing here, He's compensating his loss of contact with reality by constructing fantasies, which give him the illusion of power and control over non-exists. What else is socialism but an endeavor to regain a lost sense of significance in the scheme of things? A great part of socialist literature challenges comparison with the fairy tales of a primitive people and cannot be regarded as serious contribution to the science of social organization. That's the type of thing what Mayo is writing. So of course, this type of discourse can be extremely appealing for CEOs in the US. So then I don't have much time, so I'll go through that. So if you look again for the HRS on behavioral paternalism, we had in both cases the idea of the individual as a pathological deviant from the rational norm. We have biases, we are prone to socialist reveries. In both cases, so in behavioral paternalism, there is a process, didn't discuss that, of preference purification. We have to discover what are the true preferences of the agent. So we have some econometric technique to do that. Mayo's, he was proposing counseling interviews. On the idea of counseling interviews, just you have to discuss with person to treat their responses as symptoms and to try to discover what is a true motive, what are the true motives behind that. So you have to discover kind of hidden rational truths behind that and ignore all the psychological noise on top of it. So given that individuals are stupid fundamentally, we need some skilled some skilled elites to organize that. And not only this is not only something necessary, but they have a duty to do that. As behavioral economics, so if you look at some of Sunstein writing, it's quite explicit. So we have a perspective of a social planner. It's not necessarily clear who is we, but we have to do something when we know that people make poor choices. So it is our duty to put the right nudges to improve the navigability of the choice environment, to put the right default option, etc., because otherwise people will be maybe harmed. With the HRS, what we need to do is to adjust workers to the workplace, but the reference point is the quality of the relationship with authority, as seen from the viewpoint of the authority figure, because Mayo is counseling first the managers and not the employees, actually. So why does it work? Because we have something which is a bit weird, that if we look at the inner rational agent, so that's my point in the other paper, that there is no good psychological foundation for that. In Mayo's writing, actually, it's not good psychology either. So it's a nice story, but actually there is no good psychological foundation for that. But among academics, it works quite well. So my idea is that scientifically it's not that good, but politically it's extremely acceptable. At the time, you have a strong political support of the Harvard Business School where developing this kind of thesis by major CEOs. Today, nudges are seen as a cheap and effective policy tools. And furthermore, it seems that we can save the world without constraining the supply side of the market. So that could be something that could be appealing. So if we look at that, so we have a political theory, but since it's appealing to people in power, in the end, we may suggest wrong policies, like for nudging, we don't care about the supply side of the market. If we say if people are poor, maybe it's their fault because they make bad financial decisions. It's not because actually they are poor from many generations. And in both cases, we have this idea that the social order, that the equilibrium should be the normative locus. We need social engineers to ensure the stability and resilience of society, of this order, by putting the right nudges, by putting the right incentive in the workplace. And in the end, we just have to marginally alter the environment so as to adjust people to the environment and not fix the environment directly. And the main risk of that, for the Americans among us, we know that you know that there is a high risk that if we defend this idea of experts, this will fuel populism, the reputation of expertise, and in the end, we may end up with very bad leaders. So this happens, unfortunately, it's happened in the US, it could happen in Europe. So that's one of the main worry. And if we continue to have this more epistocratic approach, this can be problematic in the future. And I will stop here and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guilhem. So we have time for comments and questions. Again, just raise your hand and then open the mic. I see Mary. Yes, Mary, please.
Yes, thank you. That was a very, very interesting discussion of the terrain, and I'm just wondering whether just wondering how far the term narrative is really taking you here. So there's clearly a narrative of the history of the engagement between economics and whatever form of psychology is, and Mayo's intervention and the move towards nudging, when I can see that as a narrative that you can be telling externally as looking back over the field. And I can see that there were some narratives inside those positions. So for instance, the sort of utopian narrative that the people were socially, I don't know, somehow integrated and coherent, and industrialization came along and destroyed that. I mean, I think of that as a utopian kind of claim, but whatever, there's a narrative there. I wasn't so clear that you're sometimes using narrative when it's not really a narrative. So if we think about Harro's terminology and the sense of narrative being about getting things to relate together in various ways, which I think is a kind of base notion of narrative. It's not so clear to me that when you use the term narrative to sort of talk about the rationality assumption, that there's really a narrative in there. There may be a narrative about how that's exemplified, but I think it might be useful to think about whether each individual moves that you're talking about is itself constituting a narrative, because I think the terminology seems to be a bit slippery on some of those, and maybe it's worth, it might be something really important about the difference between position which is talking about the psychology of man, which lends itself, or automatically we have to create a narrative to tell you what it means, versus those that might be the sort of standard way of thinking about rational economic man, which is not evidently itself a narrative, but a set of assumptions from which one might make narratives. So there might be something important about the difference between a social psychology, or whatever terminology you want to give it, position which thinks that you need narratives to explain your frame, versus one that thinks actually, no, narrative is just an add-on here to explain what we mean by our set of assumptions. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. That's so. Actually, so as a, let's say, historical note, the term narrative. So this idea. So I worked on that before, and I introduced the term narrative later. So maybe it's not the right term actually. So maybe it's from that. So clearly, I didn't define precisely the term. So my ideas, or what I meant here by narrative, is mostly how. So there are two parts. Is first how we interpret mostly psychological results, on how academics discuss psychology to justify we should use psychology first in management, so this was Mayo, and then in economics, and this is behavioral economics. So it's really how academics discuss this notion and try to convince others that we have this simple story, which is that basically, let's say, people are stupid, so we should model that, and this is important because there are policy implications. So I call that a narrative. Maybe it's not the right term, but that's how I wanted to define it. But maybe actually it's not the most adequate term. But if you have another proposal for the term, I'm completely happy. I use narrative. Maybe it's not the right one.
Okay, Guilhem, thank you. Marcel, please.
Yeah, my question is about the use of normativity here, or the way it plays a role. When I hear your story, I really get a strong feeling that the whole kind of psychological turn is actually normativity in disguise. If they say, well, we love to be rational, I think that's a very strong, in my view, a very strong normative claim. It looks like it is a psychological analysis, but it's actually a strong appeal to be rational, because we, even though not only to be, but even to love it. You see, so I just wondering how normativity is still there, even though it seems to be denied that it play a role. So would you reflect on this? Or?
No, so I fully agree. So the idea of really seeing psychology as deviations from the norm. Implicitly, it says that the underlying norm is what we should achieve. And even so, in behavioral welfare economics, so the field in which we want to do behavioral welfare economics, but when preferences are not coherent, so we cannot define properly a utility function, it's clearly stated that which utility we should take in normative analysis is the true preferences which should be coherent with neoclassical standard. So this is completely explicit, and that's one of my problems with this literature, that this explicit said but not justified. Actually, we said people do that, they are very happy with that, but they never justify why actually we should just focus on the true preferences or not something else. It's just probably by convenience because we have the right tool to do that, but the normative discussion is completely completely forgotten, and I think it should be discussed. But I agree that this psychological turn is mostly, as you said, normativity in disguise. I fully agree.
Okay, thank you. Harro, please.
Yes, I would like to press you a bit on these narratives. Because my sense is that if you read this literature on nudging, and in particular Thaler and Sunstein, Thaler is, I think, famous for his narratives in Anomalies and other books, in which he always uses a sort of short story, a narrative, with a sort of point that shows the reader, hey, there is something that we need to understand differently. And I think these narratives play a very important role in making their approach to behavioral economics appealing and convincing. And to give just the example from this nudge book that became such a bestseller, they start with this narrative of a cafeteria with all sorts of assumed roles of people there, as if, say, everyone who opens the book knows how to behave in a cafeteria. And you never hear, well, if you want to have a sort of a healthy lunch, make a sandwich at home and take that to your office. Could also be something, but that's not the narrative that they're telling, because they have all these kinds of different roles that are already assumed and clear for the reader. And so psychology and social psychology comes in there in a very different way, but you never hear that because they always refer to these laboratory experiments in which people are, as you say, stupid or not completely rational, but there is a lot of social psychology in these narratives that is presupposed.
Yes, so just a comment here. So I agree that, so for Thaler, we use lots of narrative to justify behavioral economics, but it's really a way how we can frame the problem. On the problem that since there's the first one, let's say the first one is really to put the problem on the table with a nice story, then it frames how we will discuss the problem later, and then we only focus on those small problems. We forget about the rest. So as you said in the cafeteria, for the idea that we could just prepare our lunch at home and bring it. It's much healthier, probably. It's much better. But since we just focus the problem within the cafeteria, we forget about that. So so here my idea, and again, maybe it's actually not the right term. It's to draw the more general claim on the more, let's say the kind of large story which is behind all those ideas. For instance, in the cafeteria, you still have this idea that people, they enter the cafeteria, they're stupid, and we know how you should design the choice architecture, how the benevolent choice architect allows you should change the environment to make so that they have better choices, to improve their diet. So here the idea of this Homer Economicus narrative is a kind of general story which is applied to different settings, either in a cafeteria or here in the discussion there about cashew nut bowl, etc. And in the end, it's how the choice architect should arrange the problem. So that's here the Homo Economicus is more the kind of large story which is applied to different settings, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Guilhem. Beatrice is the last one. If you can be brief, Beatrice, sorry for that.
I can turn my question into a comment if you.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just wondering how does your story relates to a wider context in science in the 80s and 90s. I was thinking of two references when I was hearing you. The first one is a story told by Phil Merowski and Eddie Nika about the transformation of market design and how in models agents are supposed to handle information, and basically they chart a path towards agent using their information, towards agent becoming unable to use their information, and so leaving it to experts through first they go into auction, and in the latest type of model, they actually leave it to experts to organize auction so that information be recovered. So I was wondering whether this is a similar pattern, and I see that patterns also in history of other science. I'm thinking of all the research in the history of biology that shows that in the 80s and 90s, basically the cancer research shifted emphasis from the environmental factors into cancer to the individual factors into concern to types like how you eat and how you exercise and how you smoke and whatever, and also the genetics factors. Of course, the genetics factors does not be a responsibility, but they really emphasize that shift from environment to individual. And so I was wondering whether there was sort of like a wider trend in science in which the role in individual and the limits of individual were emphasized more broadly in the 80s and 90s.
So I agree. Yeah, I would say maybe it's a larger trend, but I don't know. I don't know precisely the references. I would say yes, I would agree. But if you can send me the references, I could look at that in detail. But I haven't time to read that.
I'll do it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Guilhem. We now move to the third presenter. So Alexandra Quack is here to present a paper together with Catherine Herfeld, a paper co-authored with Catherine Herfeld, the role of narratives in transferring rational choice models from economics into political science. Alexandra, please.
Yes, thanks. I try to share my screen. I assume that you see my slides, but not my comments. Is that right? Okay.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. Hello. It's really good to be here, and even only virtually. And thanks for having me. And I will present the paper Catherine and I have written about the role of narratives in the transfer of models, and more specifically, the transfer of game theory models in political science. Unfortunately, Catherine cannot be here because she is presenting her other paper in the parallel session. So the background to this article is the observation that game theory models have diffused widely across different academic domains, raising the question how this happens, how these models are transferred across domains. And today we look at one particular transfer. Namely, we ask how game theoretic models have been transferred from mathematics via economics into political science. And we look at this model transfer with a particular focus. So we're interested in the role that narratives might play in these processes of modification that are often involved with these model transfers. And in the article we identify three kinds of narratives, and we call them mini narratives, model narrative, and real world narrative, fulfilling different functions. But today I will talk only about one, namely about the one we've termed a model narrative. And we will argue today that in our case study, narratives play a role in the model transfer because the model narrative enabled the application of a model to a phenomenon it did not seem to be applicable to before. And before I continue, I just want to briefly note why we chose to focus on narratives. So I've recently started my doctoral work with Catherine, where I work on narratives and economic modeling. And I look at very different cases there, but in this literature on narratives and the sciences, this literature seems to suggest that narratives might also play a role in model transfer. And because Catherine has been working on model transfer. This paper kind of came to be. And the literature seems to suggest that narratives play a role and that narratives might be involved when it comes to applying models to concrete targets. And given that model transfer to raise the issue of application, so reapplication of models, we wanted to examine to what extent narratives might be resorted to meet some of the challenges of model transfer. There are basically two pillars on which we build in our article, because you can look at the issue of model transfer from at least two perspectives. So on the one hand, you can look at model transfer as a diffusion process that can be traced empirically in scientific contributions. So here you examine in which particular contributions, in which fields a certain model shows up and how these contributions relate. And on the other hand, you can look at model transfer as a construction process that can be reconstructed analytically and conceptually. And here the focus more on trying to identify the object that actually gets transferred across domains. And you examine how this object changes, how it is modified, and how it stays the same as it moves into different domains. And this first perspective builds on work that Catherine has previously done. So she has taken a close look at the spread of rational choice models using network analysis. And from this, she has developed a topology for organizing the empirical study of model transfers. And here she distinguishes between different roles the various contributions seem to fulfill. So she distinguishes between an innovator contribution that comes up with something new, in our case, a model, an elaborator contribution that clarifies, that adopts, that develops the innovator contribution, still in the field of the innovator contribution. And then a translator contribution bridges the gap between the field of the initial innovation and a new field of application. And then specialist contributions apply the innovation to study problems in this new field. And I've run now through this really quickly, and I'm sorry for this, but you will see in a second that the details really do not matter for this presentation. And as I said, the second perspective focuses more on the object that gets transferred across fields. So here the issue is how a template, so that's the term commonly used for the unit that actually gets transferred across domains. So how this template is turned into a computational model. I should add that it's still a matter for debate which notion of template is best. So some speak of theoretical templates, some of computational. We use here Humphrey's notion of a theoretical template. But in any case, then the focus lies on the construction that turns the theoretical template into a computational model. And now when Catherine ran the network analysis, she has identified the innovator, the elaborator, the translator, and the specialist contribution for the diffusion of game theoretic models into political science. And here the network analysis showed that William Riker's The Theory of Political Coalitions was the translator contribution for political science. And so today, and in this article, we use this first perspective and mainly for identifying our case study. And then in the article, we look very closely at this one contribution to see what happens in this translator contribution. So how does Riker go about to turn the template he takes from mathematics or economics into an applicable model in political science? And so just to emphasize and clarify, we take the mathematical game schemes from von Neumann and Morgenstern to be the theoretical template of the model transfer, and zoom in on the translator contribution by Riker to try to reconstruct the modification, the construction that Riker's theory is engaged in to turn the theoretical template into a computational model. Before I go into the details of our analysis, I want to give you some background about the case study we examine in this article. So it's this book, The Theory of Political Coalitions. It was written in 1962 by William Riker, an American political scientist. And Riker, like many others, was very impressed by the contributions by von Neumann and Morgenstern, and thought that their contributions could be usefully employed in his field, that's political science. And with this book particularly, Riker pursued quite an ambitious project So he wanted to turn political science into proper science, by which he meant that political science should pursue a naturalistic methodology where political scientists target causal relationships, come up with accurate predictions, use mathematical models. But the aspect of his ambition that interests us here most is that the mathematics of game theory really was very new back then. So it was not common, and not many people of his political science audience were familiar with the mathematics. So what you now see on the right-hand side is one of the reviews that came out at the time, where the reviewer emphasizes that the book itself, so apart from the appendix, does not contain much mathematics. Another reviewer even straightforwardly admitted that he's in no position to evaluate the mathematics of Rijke's work. And this is here just to say that in this contribution, Rijke really had to show an audience unfamiliar with these tools, that these tools can be used, how they can be used, and that it is useful and fruitful to use them. Secondly, now on the right-hand side, you see an extract from von Neumann and Morgenstern's book, and like many others, Rijke didn't adopt everything from this book. He chose one particular contribution, and he chose to adopt the game scheme of n-person zero-sum games in characteristic function form. And Rijke defended this choice very explicitly, for he thought, and then he explained and justified, that only this particular game scheme would be suitable for studying what he thought was the key phenomenon of political science. And for him, these were coalition formation processes. Rijke even spends quite a bit of time at the beginning of his book with readjusting the whole definition of political science, so that processes of coalition formation appear as the central phenomenon political scientists should be concerned with. And he worked with this game scheme throughout the book in characteristic function form, here following von Neumann and Morgenstern, where the characteristic function form is one way to represent such games. I will now argue that he took this template, so this n-person zero-sum game in characteristic function form, and turned it into a computational model to be used in political science. But I will suggest that it is useful to distinguish two different constructive projects, so two steps in Rijke's theory. So on the one hand, he constructs what he calls a static model, and on the other hand, he constructs what he calls a dynamic model. And I will not spend much time on step one, because here the model narrative does not actually play a role, but it's important to briefly sketch what Rijke does here, what he achieves and what he does not achieve, to see what job the model narrative subsequently does, or what we claim it does. So first of all, in the book, in this first step, you can really see Rijke being engaged in quite a lot of construction work. So he starts from his template. I've said this now, n-person zero-sum games in characteristic function form. He added an interpretation appropriate for the domain of political science. So for example, he interpreted agents in the model as members of coalitions, utility as winning. He modified some assumptions, most prominently the rationality axiom. He relaxed other assumptions, and for example, he allows the different agents to have different weights, and so on. And then after he's done all of this work, he arrives at this model, which he calls a static model. And this is a computational model he has built based on the template by appropriately modifying it for the domain of political science. And he actually then does something with it. He derives a prediction about the size of the winning coalition. But the computational model he has thus built was not yet applicable to the phenomenon Rijke was interested in, which were coalition formation processes. So this computational, this static model allowed only for an analysis of one stage. It didn't inform about the general properties of processes of coalition formation. And the problem was fairly serious, because Lucien Reifer, for example, explicitly doubted whether dynamic processes could be studied with such game models. So Lucien Reifer take some time to discuss to what extent the different forms in which a game can be represented, so the normal form, the characteristic function form, or the extensive form, can help to account for social dynamics. So Luz and Reifer in their book discuss to what extent it might be possible to understand social dynamics with an extensive form game, which they judge to be very difficult, and the extent to which they think it is not possible to do so with a normal form game, and presumably then by extension, a characteristic function form game. And curiously, Riker doesn't seem to mention this in this book, but he seems to resolve the difficulty or overcome this issue. So in the book, it appears, and we can obviously discuss this, that he is able to use the model to study coalition formation processes. How does he do it? His dynamic model seems to help him meet this challenge. And in the article, we suggest that this dynamic model is better thought of as a combination of the computational model Riker has just constructed, which he terms the static model, and a model narrative. And where the model narrative specifies the generic process of coalition formation. And we argue now that this model narrative actually enables the application of the model to the phenomenon Riker wants to apply it to. First of all, how does this model narrative look like? He doesn't specify this process all in one place. It's spread across 2 chapters, but these are some of the elements. So firstly, Riker specifies that coalition formation proceeds in stages. So Riker writes, the first stage is that situation in which there are n single-member proto-coalitions. The second stage is that situation in which there is 1 2-member proto-coalition and n-2 single-member proto-coalitions. The last stage exists when there is winning coalition or 2 blocking ones. Secondly, he specifies that coalition formation proceeds in a leader-follower dynamic. So not all agents have the same role to play. Again, he writes, typically a prospective leader starts with a proposed decision. Typically also a number of like-minded members join him immediately in support of it and thereby become his followers. But the followers don't make for a winning coalition, so then the coalition formation proceeds. And later you also learn that coalition formation processes always produce a certain type of leader, which he characterizes to be opportunistic. And I don't want to dwell on the specifics here. This is just meant to share with you how this model narrative looks like and what kind of specification it is. So when I try to summarize the bits in Riker, the model narrative then comes down to a process specification where the game starts with a strategic situation characterized by a number of players with differing weights. And these weights suggest which roles the members will assume in the game. And then member leaders start the process of coalition formation by offering side payments to other member followers. And each of these moves by the members, so that's the moves are the offering and accepting of side payments, changes the strategic situation again and again and again until winning coalition has formed. And I'm never sure to what extent I have to now explain and justify that is a narrative, but just to be sure and explicit, there's no generally agreed upon definition, but we here work with a very minimal notion where narrative is a representation of a connected sequence of events, and Riker here specifies a connected sequence of events. Riker himself just terms it an abstract statement of key points that are intuitively fairly clear. And it might not be intuitively implausible, but we want to emphasize that the process of coalition formation could neither be easily identified empirically, so it was far from clear to Riker or to anyone working at the time how such processes typically occurred and what their general characteristics were, nor could it be extracted theoretically from von Neumann and Morgenstern's contributions. So this is why we claim that this narrative, this model narrative, fulfills a reconciling function, and it reconciles the model with the phenomenon the model is meant to be applied to. In other words, it enables the application of the computational model to the phenomenon the model is not well equipped to handle. Because the computational model, modified as it is for the domain of political science, as I said before, allows for the analysis of one stage only. It does not inform about general properties of processes of coalition formation. And instead, the model narrative specifies informally what the computational model does not specify formally. And through this specification, the model narrative orders the process of coalition formation such that the computational model can be applied to the phenomenon. And just very briefly, behind this ordering idea is the idea that if I now gave you the model as specified by Rijke, so the hystatic model, and tell you, please now use it to analyze, I don't know, how coalitions form in EU negotiations or something, and let's assume you are very well educated in the technical intricacies of game theory, and I would expect it to be very difficult to go ahead and use the model to study those processes and those convoluted empirical processes. And so this is just to suggest that the model narrative might actually do some work here. I want to note at this point that through the model narrative, the computational model becomes applicable, but not yet applied to a concrete case. In the article we have written, we identify another narrative, we call it a real world narrative, in which we argue that Rijke tries to apply the model to an actual particular political event in US history. And we argue that it's through this real world narrative that Rijke uses the conceptual apparatus, which we here now think of as being the computational model plus the model narrative, to study concrete political events in terms of coalition formation processes. And just to conclude, by zooming in on the role of this translator contribution, we took a closer look at the model construction process. As it is suggested in the model transfer literature, our analysis substantiates the claim that the object to be transferred across domains is likely to be modified. But in this case, we find that in addition to the construction needed for turning the template into a computational model, appropriate for this domain of political science, the model is complemented by a narrative to make it applicable to the phenomenon of interest. And therefore, the narrative plays a role in the model transfer. Rijke resorts to it to establish how von Neumann and Morgenstern's theoretical template can be applied to typical cases of political coalition formation processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for this very interesting presentation. So questions and comments? Marcel, please.
Yes, thank you, Alexandra, for this very nice paper. It really fills a gap in the literature, and I very much like the idea of the work the narrative does it, of course, in your specific kind of way. But it's a very nice paper in that sense. It brings a lot of things together. Therefore, I felt a little bit distracted, actually, and that is, yes, it wouldn't be fair to your paper by the terminology you're using. And so, actually, my basic question is, why do you want to stay so close to Humphrey's terminology? Because you use the term theoretical template and the computational model. It is nothing about computational models, in my view. And so why not, if you think about the template, if you want to have something in front of it, why not have something like mathematical or model template or other kinds of options that seems to be more appropriate to what you would like to say. So this is just a question about the chosen, not about the story. I very much like the argumentation in your paper, as I understood it, but why the chosen terminology? So that is what my question is about.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. It gets to something we have not settled yet, I think. There's some, it's still a piece of work, and so we have not decided yet which terminology to use. It was just for this presentation that we decided upon this one. I think Catherine is inclined to go with this Humphrey's account, because I think it structured her analysis in the network analysis. But we have been debating this a lot, which terminology to use, and I don't be doing so much. Or I mean, I'm new to this business, but I think we're doing so much that we try to keep some things stable. And so, because Catherine's account of translator was kind of the thing we wanted to zoom in on, and then we just for the moment kept these other things, didn't change them as well. But I think I'm sure there will be work has to be done on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Harro, please.
Thanks, Alexandra. Really a very interesting paper. My question is about the work that both the model narrative and the real world narrative are doing. In principle, I see both notions as useful, but then in a sense your story makes them not useful because you say that it's neither empirically nor from theory of games and economic behavior, that this model narrative, it follows neither from the one nor from the other. And so when you say it's reconciling, it's not quite clear to me what it is reconciling at all. And later on, you italicized can be applied, but it could not be applied. That was what you just said. And so I see that it is doing something because the reviewer was quite enthusiastic, or so it seemed, about this book. But what is this reviewer actually enthusiastic about? Is perhaps my question, because the work that might be done by showing that game theory might be useful for the analysis of political coalition formation has not been showed. And still it has been showed because the story, apparently the narrative, is told in the words of game theory. So it is reconciling something, but I would like to understand better how it is doing the reconciling work.
Yeah, thanks. Tough ones. I had two parts to the answer, I think. The first about how exactly is reconciling. How we think, or I think about it at the moment, is that this thing he kind of adopts is not very. It's not straightforward. Okay, let's be concrete. He has this problem. He wants to study one political coalition formation, and it's not very clear how the tool he gets from von Neumann and Morgenstern should go about employing it. And that's why the claim comes in that these narratives and kind of bridge the gap, reconcile the phenomenon with the model that is not actually applicable to it. And the form in which he then seems to be able to use this model he takes from von Neumann is this narrative form. The second the problem with this is that because we speak of the model narrative and the real world narrative, that it's not clear how these two really interact, because if there was no model narrative, it would be much clearer what this real world narrative does. So they kind of, because there is this model narrative, seems to detract from the importance of this. And so we have to figure out what is doing what here. So yeah, that we have to specify more.
Thank you very much.
If that helps.
Thank you. Maxime, please.
Thank you, Alexandra. This is, I also find this very interesting. Just a suggestion, I don't know if you have considered it either in this paper or potentially as another side case story you could analyze with your framework is Buchanan and Tulloch's Calculus of Consent was published exactly in the same year as Riker, right? And they also have two chapters written by Buchanan on game theory, and both of which, or at least the thrust is clearly Luce and Reifa and Martin Schubeck. It's not directly von Neumann and Morgenstern. It's also a sort of, that's their starting point. And I think there's a very vast literature on the origin of public choice, especially on Buchanan, but I don't think, I might have missed that, but I don't think there's been much commentary on Buchanan's use of game theory in 62, which is, again, exactly the same year as Riker. So I think it would be interesting to compare the use of I think if I remember, it's a sort of fixed number of person constant sum game that they use as their main model to explain majority voting.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really important note, because we have this very narrow analysis. We just, in this broader context, we look at this one contribution and only what happens in this one contribution. So we need to get at the comparisons between what other people have been doing at one point. So thank you.
Thank you, Guilhem.
So thank you for the paper. So I would have, again, so just a suggestion, so maybe you have no answer to that. So here, one of your points that the modern narrative allow actually to fill the gap between the static and dynamic stage without caring about the mathematical details. We don't know how we move from stage to stage because we have this nice model narrative. So maybe it could be interesting to contrast that with what's happening in evolutionary game theory, which is completely dynamic, but in this case, we have a clear mathematical model, how we move from stage to stage, but the interpretation, the story is completely vague. So actually we say, yeah, it's a kind of imitation, but it's not clear. So here, probably, maybe we have the opposite situation. We have lots of details about the mathematical model, but the narrative is less clear. Usually we just say it's cultural transmission, and that's over, but without more elements. So maybe it could be interesting to contrast both approaches.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that comes much later, right? So looking at what happens, how it gets from A to B, it might not be so crucial, but for the contrast and to see, maybe to get more at this, what work is it doing and what work does it not do? That might be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for attending this session, and hope to see you in the next sessions. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.